So our next talk is got a very interesting and catching title to it. What's culture got to do with it? Exploring the intersection of diversity and medicine. And I'll introduce Brian Shimamoto, and then maybe give a little bit of background on what we're trying to achieve in the Department of Surgery and why we're trying to achieve this. So Brian is the Organizational and Employee Development Manager in the Department of Surgery. He recently joined us within the last year or so. Previous to this, he served as Assistant Director of Human Resources at CU Denver and has formal training in this area with a Master in Educational Psychology from CU Boulder. And I don't think I have to describe to anyone on the Zoom call that we've had some pretty horrible events that have occurred in the last year. But the reality of the situation as applies to diversity and culture within our society. But the reality is this has been going on for hundreds of years, and it bubbled to the surface, at least to the news surface this last year. But we have a real issue, I think, in this country, and we have an issue in the university, and we have an issue in the Department of Surgery. And I think the best way to improve upon our situation as it applies to diversity and medicine is to discuss it, talk about it, understand the various viewpoints, understand where we've been, where we are now, and where we need to go, because we need to make changes. And Dr. Kia Washington, who's our Vice Chair in the Department of Surgery of Diversity and Inclusion, and Brian and many others have worked and are developing a series of talks during the year that will be given during grand rounds. And what I want and what we all want is discussion. I think we should all learn. We should all contribute, and we should make the Department of Surgery a better place, make it diverse, make it inclusive, and make everyone comfortable being a part of our department. Now, I hope we've come a little bit towards the goal in the last 5 and 10 years, but we still have a long way to go. And culture has everything to do with it. And Peter Drucker, who's one of the gurus of management, who was on the cover of Time magazine in the 1950s, was one of the first people to say culture is important. And his quote is, "Culture eats strategy for lunch. Culture eats strategy for lunch." And that is so true. So with that long-winded introduction, Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schulich. I'm just going to share my my screen so that everybody can see the PowerPoint. And good morning. Again, my name is Brian Shimamoto. I am the OED manager for our department, and I'm very pleased to be here this morning and honored to be able to talk to you about this very important topic today. So just some of the objectives that we have for the next 20 minutes or so, hopefully to allow each of us, as we're going through this presentation, to understand these three objectives, to be able to understand and summarize why what's happening in the United States today and as it relates to race relations in our country can be referred to as a racial reckoning. I'm also hopefully will be able to describe and share with you some strategies that will help us acquire intercultural awareness, knowledge, and skills, and some of the strategies that the DEI committee is putting in place. And then finally, just to recognize the role, as Dr. Schulich said, that culture has and its effect on the practice of medicine. So I'm going to jump right in, go through this stuff really, really quickly. Just to highlight, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is what we talk about quite a bit in our committee, and the focus for our work for on behalf of the department. Here's a quote by Andres Tapia that says, "Diversity is the mix, just like all these different spices we see on the screen, and inclusion is making the mix work." So we can't just add any old spice and any old order or amount and come up with a good recipe. We want to make sure that we are focused on all the different parts of who we are, and we believe that diversity is a strength. But we want to make sure that we're focused on how to balance all those things and bring out the best in everything. And that's what inclusion is really all about. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion, D&I all the time, it's about recognizing how who we are we bring our uniqueness, all of our different cultural identities and our experiences, our cultural understandings, and that makes us a stronger department. But with all of that diversity, sometimes there are challenges because we misunderstand, we were raised differently, we have different cultural backgrounds. So inclusion is the active process of making that mix work as good as possible. But then what about the E, the equity part? Well, if I were to ask everybody to take off their left shoe, and we made a pile of shoes in the middle of our virtual room. And so now we're all missing a shoe. And I were just to take each shoe that I had in the pile and just gave everybody a shoe back, what we would have in that scenario is equality, because everybody would have two shoes, but not everybody would have their matching shoe or a shoe that's going to fit for them. So equity is really about giving everyone a shoe that fits. And so you can see here in this illustration here, the idea that equality is giving everybody the same thing. Equity is about giving people what they need in order to make sure that everybody can be successful. And unfortunately, in the little cartoon here, this is sometimes the reality and the way people experience things, which is why DEI is so important to everything that we do. Whether we are physicians or we're staff, we're educators, it's important for us to understand how these things work. So as a member of the DEI committee, here is our current committee. As you can see, it's made up of many folks from across the department, both faculty as well as some staff members. And we are led by Dr. Washington, our vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has really set a path for us to look at how to support diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to advance our efforts as a department. So as we move into this new year, we are really focusing on 4 different areas. And what we see here are those areas would include diversifying our recruitment and retention, focusing on education and communication for our department within the School of Medicine, looking at issues of equity, transparency, and justice for our department in particular, and also leadership equity and providing opportunities for diverse folks to have leadership opportunities. The 4 individuals we see in each corner here are the current sort of leaders who are working with us as members of these subcommittees, and we're working on setting priorities and objectives right now for this academic year to show, to advance in these particular areas. So just to give you an example here, Jonathan Radin is working with a group of folks within our department and our committee on recruitment and retention. So why is that important to focus on diversifying recruitment and retention? Well, what we can just see here, this is some data that we pulled out early on. You can see that between 2012 and 2018, when we look at the makeup of the faculty in our department, we have increased faculty by gender, right? So you know, and here this particular graph is representing the faculty ranking by gender, and so we can see that, you know, in 2012 we had you know, full professors, 24 full professors, but they were all men, and by 2018 we started to see more full professors, female full professors as well. So this is, again, this is along the line, this is the direction that we're trying to do to diversify by gender. We also looked at data, the data that we had based on race and ethnicity. This is the faculty breakup. You can tell the difference, see the difference here between 2012 and again 2018, that we're seeing a little more diversity in terms of race and ethnicity in our faculty, but we, you know, with the goal for the committee, the subcommittee with recruitment and retention is to try to increase that. And so that's part of what this committee is focused on, working on doing. Another area, as an example, for within the diversity committee is our education and communications subcommittee, where we really want to focus on helping people understand the nuances, because one of the things about diversity, equity, inclusion is that it is complicated. And it's difficult to understand, and it has all sorts of subtle differences. And so the Education and Communication Subcommittee is really focused on how can we bring the messages to our department and help people understand some of the nuances a little bit differently. So let's again think about some of the objectives that I had for this presentation. A quote here by Brene Brown, if you're familiar with her, and she says, "The reckoning is how we walk into our story, and the rumble is where we own it." She's the first person I heard refer to what's happening in the United States right now as a racial reckoning. And as soon as she said that, I knew what she was talking about based on her writings and some of her research. She refers to a reckoning. What she's referring to there is that in navigation, dead reckoning is the process of calculating your current position by using a previously determined position and using estimations of your speed and your course over time to figure out where you are, right? And so in terms of a racial reckoning and what's going on in our country right now, we have to think about that as an opportunity for us to figure out where we are today when it comes to race relations in the United States by understanding better where we've been and what we've been through, so that we can plot a better course for the future. Where do we want to be as a country when it comes to race relations? For us to understand that, we have to be able to look back. We have to say what's going on. On August 9th of 2014, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And many of us will remember that. And that was the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. What is interesting, however, though, is since 2014, the number of deaths has stayed pretty consistent. And so what's going on? And what makes 2020 different with the murder of George Floyd? What I think we're discovering as a nation, and potentially also on our campus when we look at the White Coats for Black Lives movement, for us, is that there was this perfect storm of a pandemic, and people are afraid, and lots of things are going on. And then when we're seeing what happened, we're recognizing that there's been a new resurgence of people paying attention to Black Lives Matter and recognizing the importance of understanding systemic racism. Okay, and for whatever reason, we're in a space as a nation, and people are finding themselves going, over time, we're not seeing a difference. What can I do? What can I do differently? And so this link here that you'll be able to access after later on today or stuff like that is a photo essay that was published in the New York Times that really just kind of gives a timeline and is a summary of what went on, starting with the death of George Floyd in May of this year, and why things maybe have turned out to be a little bit different across the country, and how it has stimulated a lot more protest, and people are really asking themselves, what can I do? What's different? As a committee, we want to make sure that people understand that racism as a form of oppression is not a simple sort of thing. It's not it's not just a series of individual acts. Systemic racism is like a layer cake. For many people in the world, especially for folks who don't have to deal with racism on a daily basis, I have a tendency to think sometimes of racism as, again, those individual acts. So when we look at the murder of George Floyd, oftentimes people will say, well, we have to look at the police officers and the people responsible for his death and those individual acts of racism. But racism in our country operates on different levels, and supporting individual racism is institutional racism, where there are policies and procedures that reinforce racial stereotypes. So the way perhaps the police in this case were trained would be an example of institutional racism, and that their training would be racist in some sort of way. And then the bottom layer that we can think about this is the cultural racism that's happening in our society, the culture, the norms that tell us in our country that that people who are darker are less trustworthy or more prone to violence or need to be treated a specific sort of way. You know, and I think that this theoretical model that I'm referring to here, I like it because I think it highlights that even if we eradicate individual racist acts or individual discriminatory acts in ourselves, that's just taking off the top layer of the cake. The second two layers, institutional racism and cultural racism, still exists. And so how do we deal with this? What do we do? How, you know, if I want to make a difference and I want to be want to do better, how do I do that is really the question that we find ourselves asking. That's about creating inclusion, and it is about understanding not only other people but ourselves better in order to do that. So when the second objective for my talk this morning was really kind of helping us figure out how do we develop strategies to develop awareness, knowledge, and skills. So in terms of that, the gaining of awareness, knowledge, and skills is how we're going to make a difference. Awareness is focusing on self-awareness, on our place in the world and how we experience things and how our experience may be different than the experience of others, right? Then knowledge would be understanding and gaining knowledge about other cultural groups and how their experiences are different. So my experience as a man, a cisgender man in this country is going to be different than, let's say, the experience of a woman of color. And so I have to understand how I move through the world, and then try to better understand how she may experience the world, so that ultimately we can figure out that inclusion is about all of us, and it's about both of us. And that's where we start to develop the skills. We learn to kind of say, to look at what I know to be true, what they know to be true, and how those may differ, and try to learn from that and experience that better. So when we talk about culture and the practice of medicine, or a culture being in everything, it's really about understanding that what my parents may have taught me when I was growing up are not the same messages that Dr. Washington's parents taught her about the way the world works, about the way medicine works. And so we need to understand what we were taught, and then take that opportunity to compare those to understand better and to create more inclusion. Now, how can we support that? What sort of strategies can we provide as a department to help each of us develop awareness, knowledge, skills? Well, the committee worked together to create a resource page here, and this is a short link that we can make that we will make available to everyone. But hopefully, you'll be able to see this in just a moment. It'll open up on the screen here. But this is a resource page that the committee has put together and has shared with the entire School of Medicine, actually, and we've been getting some really great feedback from folks. Here on the resource page, we have an explanation for why we put this together. We also have a space here. The dean sent out a message with a link to to this resource page, talking about the One Book, One Campus campaign this year and how that's going on. And what we did is we put together resources to help us be better by gaining awareness. So when I say us, the people who might need to gain more self-awareness when it comes to racism might be white people or people who are white identified. Then to understand better would be that knowledge piece. So what are the experiences of people of color in the United States? And then how can we do better? What are the skills we can do? This column would be resources that would help us develop some of those skills. So, you know, this resource page is available to all of us, to all of you. It includes, again, lots of resources that we can read. Resources such as videos that we can watch. Some of them are short videos, some of them are longer, including we have some documentaries, some mainstream films that are listed here, and things we can listen to, including podcasts as well. There's a section here on how to talk about race and racism with our children, our racial equity challenge. So there's a lot of resources, and this continues to grow because as people become more aware of what we've put together here as a committee for our department as well as for other folks, people are like, oh, here's another great resource. Let's take a look at that. Please look at that as well. And so here we have that be better, understand better, do better is the same sort of thing as awareness, knowledge, and skills. All right, so I'm going to close the webpage. We go back to wrap up the PowerPoint. So that's one resource that we have provided and to help us gain that awareness, knowledge, skills, and help you do the same. And then just to wrap up this morning, I wanted to talk a little bit about culture, right? What has culture got to do with it? I'll use the definition of culture to be a shared system of values, beliefs, and learned patterns of behavior. And so all the groups that we belong to as individuals have culture. Okay, so many people, you can think of this as my family is the first group that passed on their culture to me, right? Talk to me as a young child about what our values were as a family and how we were supposed to show up, what we believe in, and definitely the learned taught me how to behave and how I was supposed to show up as a parent right now. Every day I'm having these really interesting conversations with my son to try to help him understand what we think is important and help him explain things. So we were, on Friday, the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we as a family ended up watching On the Basis of Sex, which is a dramatization of one of her earliest cases. And he kept saying as a 9-year-old, oh, that's really sexist. And so we had to pause the movie and say, well, what do you mean when you say that? And we talked it through as a family to make sure that he understood some of the nuances, as best we could with a 9-year-old. And so again, what is culture? It's passed on to us and we learn it. And a real simple example of that is this, right? It's the moon. When we look up at the moon at night, we pretty much see the same thing. But in the United States, when we look at the moon, we often will say that we see the man in the moon. There's a sort of a face there. But what we discover when we do a little bit of research and dig a little bit deeper is that depending on where we come from in the world, we may see something different in the moon. So some cultures will see a rabbit in the moon. Other cultural groups will see a different sort of man in the moon. Some see handprints. In India, they see handprints. In Hawaii, they see a tree in the moon. And then in New Zealand, they see actually a woman in the moon. So here's the same celestial body, the moon, that sits in the night sky. And yet, depending on where we come in the globe, where we're from, we're taught to see different things. So regardless of what you see when you look at the moon, it is cultural in nature. It is what we were taught, and it's how we make sense of the world. So again, this shared system of values, beliefs, and learned behaviors, it's important for us to recognize that and understand that, especially as we interact with other folks. And so I have a number of articles here that I did some research on to share about culture and medicine. Again, these are all links and we'll make them all available to everybody. But this culture sort of piece is interacting with medicine every single day. As we find ourselves existing in this world of a pandemic and with the coronavirus, we know there are a lot of different companies that are working on developing a vaccine to try to help us, overcome COVID, and yet we're having a really hard time. These companies are having a really hard time to have participants of color within the study. And so there are a couple articles here that talk about Tuskegee and how that history has created a dynamic that makes some communities, some cultural groups distrustful of medicine, and especially studies. There's also, I found an interesting article here about racial differentials in medical care and the implications for research on women as well. So these are some interesting resources I think you might find interesting reading. Also, there's some of our culture, some of us are raised to believe different things about different kinds of people. Again, whether that's a matter of based on their gender or based on their skin color or based on their height or based on the way they speak, whether or not they are the right fit or whether they are a good person to work side by side with. And there's an interesting sort of study here about, a well-documented thing in medicine where there's some racial bias when it comes to assessing and treating pain in different communities, right? And so that, again, I thought that was an interesting sort of resource that might be interesting for folks to read. So ultimately, what does culture have to do with the practice of medicine? I think it has a lot to do with it, because depending on where we come from and what we were taught and how we were taught is going to impact the way we show up and the way we interact with others. And as Dr. Schulich was saying just before I jumped on, it's important for us to see what's going on, that this racial reckoning that's happening in the country gives us a unique opportunity to kind of, learn about why things are the way they are today, so that we can make differences, make changes, so that we're living in a world, or that my son can grow up in a world that is better than the one that I grew up in, and is better than the one that my parents grew up in. And that requires us to pay attention. And sometimes it requires us to sit with some very painful, difficult sorts of realities. So as a member of the education subcommittee for the DEI committee, we are, as Dr. Schulich said, are trying to put together a curriculum so that over the course of a few years, you might see someone or different individuals from the committee presenting and talking a little bit about some things that we could know, that we could learn, so that we understand things better and hopefully can work together to make the world a little bit better for us and for our patients. So that's it for me. That's my talk, and those are my objectives. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Schulich.
Thank you, Brian. And this is such a huge topic. My guess is people are going to be a little bit shy in typing into the chat function. Oh, no, maybe not. But before we get to Jenny Ann's comment, I just want to say that there are many things that we need to do, but one really important thing is to discuss what the issues are or are not. And I think, we have great people in this department, and, and the key is to be respectful and understand that there are multiple points of view, and that this is a work in progress, and that we just have to, move forward. And, one concept that I really picked up on this year, I knew about it, but I really picked up on this year, is there's a huge difference between being a bystander and an upstander. And I think for, large swaths of my life, I've been a bystander. And I hope there are many other people in the department who feel the same way, but it's time actually to be an upstander. And many of you hold very respected positions within the department, within your place of faith, within your community. And I think we cannot just sit and watch this anymore. You actually have to do something. And sometimes doing something means talking about it. Other times it means being, much more active than just talking about it. But we have to move this ball.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to remember that it's difficult. One thing that I try to remind myself of is that being a good person is actually not a state of being, but it is a practice. And so when we can lean into conversations and kind of say, what do I do that actually helps move justice forward? What do I do, and how do I show up? How do I learn about this? And when someone actually calls me out or calls me in, that's another thing that we'll talk about down the road, is calling in versus calling out. But when someone confronts me and says, hey, Brian, something you said sounded a little bit sexist or sounded a little bit racist, it doesn't mean I'm a card-carrying member of the KKK, but it does help me improve. And that sometimes means that I have to sit in uncomfortable spaces to understand how to be better and to show up in the best way possible.
Yeah. So Jenny Ann's question is multi-pronged, but what are we doing as a department to attack and improve and make the culture of our department better? And Well, I mean, you know, this is one of the activities that we are doing. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion group is very new and has gained a lot of steam and has active participation. Kia Washington and many others in the department have really focused on these topics, and we're moving, you know, not fast enough, obviously, but we're moving. We do have coaches. A hospital survey was actually just completed showing that, you know, there are issues on this campus, as you might expect, and as good as, you know, some of us think we are, we're not. We have the same ills that affect our society in general on this campus. So learning about this, acknowledging it, discussing it, and then doing you know, very structured things like talks at grand rounds, having a DEI committee, and also they have worked very hard. Brian, you've worked very hard with Kia and the others that you showed to come up with a departmental plan, which I think is about to be presented to me, and I look forward to that. And so, yeah, and you know, I can tell you, whatever we're about to do, it's not enough. We have to do more. And so, keep those questions coming, Jenny Ann, and I want you to push for this too.